Lecture 18, Jean-Paul Sartre at War.
Jean-Paul Sartre is the ultimate existentialist. He named the movement, and when people talk about existentialism, it's typically his philosophy they have in mind. The characteristics that I've mentioned previously, the emphasis on freedom and choice, and responsibility in particular, are very much the centerpieces of his philosophy, and as I pointed out with some of the members of the movement, Nietzsche for example, they aren't particularly central, and with someone like Heidegger, they're also problematic. Sartre's existentialism really does focus on one concept above all else, and that is the concept of responsibility. Perhaps the only person who followed him through and considered herself an existentialist along with him was his equally remarkable lifelong partner, Simone de Beauvoir, and of their relationship I'm going to have something to say a bit later on. Sartre wrote voluminously. In fact, it's said that he wrote as much as 20 pages a day, every day of his life, and he lived into his 70s. But the idea is that what he wrote was so varied and so, in a way, all over the place, that to talk about Sartre's philosophy is really just to talk about a piece of a very grand campaign. He wrote literature, some of it I would consider excellent. He wrote a great many journal articles, magazine pieces, and of course, newspaper pieces throughout his life. He was very deeply politically engaged, and perhaps he is best known among writers for his defense of what he called engaged literature, which would include philosophy. The idea is that philosophy must be nothing if not practical, and that meant for him political. One doesn't write for the enjoyment of it, one doesn't write for the prestige, one doesn't write for the external rewards. And as evidence of this, when he received the Nobel Prize in 1964, he rather dramatically turned it down. Sartre's writings in politics are very often, I think, eccentric. But his writings in philosophy, I think, deserve to be recognized as some of the greatest in the 20th century. He follows very closely on Martin Heidegger, and you'll see there's a good deal of influence there. But unlike Heidegger, who was often a bit vague on such notions as freedom and responsibility, Sartre is absolutely straightforward. It is from him that I essentially take the notion, no excuses, the idea that one is always responsible, one cannot beg off, one cannot push the blame on someone else, but one is always responsible for what one does, who one is, and perhaps more problematically, for the state of the world. Much of Sartre's writing, and in particular his great book, Being in Nothingness, which will form the core of most of what I'll be saying, was written during the German occupation. In fact, Sartre was in prison camp for a short time. One should carefully distinguish this from the horror of the German concentration camps. He had access to literature, he had access to books and writing materials, and consequently, it's really from his place in the German camp that he begins the ideas and the writing of Being in Nothingness. We have a rather full set of letters between himself and Simone, and I will say, despite the rather coldness of some of Sartre's writings, in those letters at least, he shows himself to be a warm, caring human being. But anyway, it's during the German occupation that he writes this, and it's the occupation itself which gives Sartre really the impetus for his basic thesis. There's an irony perhaps here, and that is that he borrows in his language and in his ideas very heavily, not only from Heidegger, but from other German philosophers as well. But his target really is not the Germans. The target is his fellow Frenchmen. He denounced them for their cowardice, for their hypocrisy, for their collaboration. And much of this, of course, is becoming evident only really in the last 10 years as some of the files are opened up and we can see how the average Frenchman really did behave during the war. Sartre was particularly bothered by the disclaimers and the excuses that people made about why they did what they did, why they didn't, for example, join that movement called the Resistance, the French underground which was trying to undermine the German occupation, or why people actually collaborated and pursued their careers, perhaps to their own advantage, but very often to to the clear disadvantage of the French community. In general, the idea of excuses must have weighed very heavily on him. What's more, it's an excellent test for an age-old philosophical question. That is, what is human nature? Now, if you go into some aspects of philosophy, that question gets answered in a very armchair sort of way. We imagine human beings before the advent of society. We imagine human beings in the so-called state of nature. And then we kind of make up, on the basis of our casual experience, what people must have been like. And one set of theories says people are basically selfish and not very nice to each other. Another set of theories says that basically people are basically content and sort of indifferent to one another, that it's society that causes them to have the traits that they have. And another theory yet might be that people in the state of nature really are already looking for recognition from others. But this is armchair philosophy, and it has very little to back it up, except for one's rather casual experiences of people in ordinary life. In recent Oxford philosophy, analyses of human nature often take the form of people keeping promises and what people do as good citizens of a civilized state. But suppose you take the question of human nature in a different way. Suppose you think that human nature betrays itself not in everyday behavior, but rather it's something that you have to discover only by putting human beings under stress. You take the analogy from chemistry. If you have a bit of stuff that you want to analyze, you don't just look at it, but what you do is you see what happens if you subject it to enormous pressure, or heat it to a boiling point, or treat it with acid, or a strong base, or perhaps bombard it with neutrons, or put it in liquid nitrogen and see what it does. In other words, by putting it under enormous stress, what you discover is what it really is. And Sartre has this view, which he shares, by the way, with Camus, which, if you want to understand human nature, you can't just sort of look at people in their daily bourgeois existence, but rather you have to look at people under the greatest stress. And perhaps there's no greater stress than being occupied by an army during the midst of one of the most horrible wars in the history of humanity. So what he saw as he watched his fellow citizens and as he dealt with them in his own minor role in the resistance was that people would do what they did, collaborate, or in any case, cooperate. And what they said about what they did almost always came out in terms of excuses. For example, what can I do? The kind of excuse from impotence. The idea is that the forces of history and the German army is so overwhelmingly powerful. And here I am, one lone individual, perhaps even without arms. What could I possibly do? Or there's the argument from innocence. I didn't start the war. The idea of innocence here is one that we've run across in Camus, who at this time is very much a colleague of Sartre. It's a notion that we've run across in perhaps other philosophers too, and notably, for example, in Heidegger, who in a very different sense talks about innocent guilt. But with Sartre, the idea of innocence takes on a rather striking notion, because it's not the abstract metaphysical notion that you get, for example, in Heidegger, and it's not the very generalized kind of notion of original sin that you get in Camus, but rather it's a notion of innocence which has to do with making excuses. One begs off by saying, I'm not responsible, therefore. There's the notion of everyone else is doing it, the appeal to a kind of herd instinct, going back to Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. The idea that everyone else was collaborating, the idea that one's friends were not doing anything to aid the resistance, that in itself seemed to be an adequate excuse for a great many people. And of course, we hear today in all sorts of contexts, for example, people in business who say, well, I really know this is wrong, but everyone else is doing it. It's another excuse, and it's just the kind of excuse that Sartre wants to get rid of. There's the I'm just looking out for me excuse, the appeal to self-preservation, the idea that each of us, in a sense, is a selfish, or at any rate, self-interested being, and so what I'm doing is just natural. It's what anyone would do in a similar situation, and if they're not, then that's their problem. There is the I had no choice excuse.